Princess Louise Élisabeth was melting into necrotic pus on her silk bed. Desperate doctors resorted to butchery, draining veins, slicing infected lesions without anesthesia, searing peeling skin with acid. A biological nightmare. The stench alone drove the King of France out of the room. But before the rot, there was only gold, perfume, and power. Mid-18th century Versailles was a gilded cage where a woman's only currencies were beauty and political utility. Louise Élisabeth, born in 1727, had both. As Louis XV's firstborn, Madame Royale, she commanded absolute reverence, yet her real power lay in her bond with the king. Louis XV wasn't a distant political architect. He was a fiercely loving father, and she was his favorite. She was the only person in France who bypassed Versailles' suffocating etiquette. She burst into his chambers unannounced. Her laughter cut through state affairs. She was the king's anchor to humanity. But a king's affection couldn't stop the brutal arithmetic of dynastic politics. Childhood at Versailles ended fast. In 1739, at just 12 years old, she was sold. Betrothed to Infante Philip of Spain, she became the human collateral binding the French and Spanish Bourbon courts. Her departure shattered the royal family. Louis XV wept openly, a statue cracking in public. As her carriage dragged her to Madrid, the 12-year-old wrote agonizing letters to her father, describing every mile as a crushing physical weight. She arrived in a severe, deeply conservative Spanish court, no vibrant energy, no father, just an expectation to be a silent breeding vessel for an amiable husband she easily outsmarted. The years hardened her. When the War of the Austrian Succession concluded in 1748, her husband was granted the Duchy of Parma in Italy. She was no longer a displaced princess, she was a ruling duchess. And with that power came an insatiable ambition. Louise Élisabeth refused to languish in the political obscurity of a minor Italian province. She craved the center of the world. She craved Versailles. She returned to France repeatedly, utilizing her unmatched influence over her father to secure funds, favors, and advantageous marriages for her own children. She became a formidable political operator, a master of courtly theater. Whispers in the corridors referred to her simply as the Beauty of Versailles, a moniker that acknowledged both her striking physical presence and her sharp, calculating mind. By late 1759, at 32 years old, she was at the absolute zenith of her power. She had returned to France once more, deep in negotiations with the powerful minister Choiseul, weaving complex diplomatic webs to secure her family's future. She was healthy, radiant, and utterly consumed by the pursuit of earthly influence. Yet, her absolute zenith of power coincided with a biological ambush. The terrifying contrast between her political peak and her total physical erasure began in a year of extreme turbulence. The year 1759 was a crucible of fire and blood for the French Empire, providing a grand chaotic backdrop to the deeply personal tragedy that was about to unfold within the walls of Versailles. The 7 Years' War was raging across multiple continents, draining the royal treasury and casting a long, dark shadow over the reign of King Louis XV. France was suffering humiliating defeats on land and at sea. The military was overstretched, and the atmosphere at court was thick with paranoia and shifting alliances. It was precisely into this geopolitical storm that Louise Élisabeth, the Duchess of Parma, rode in the autumn of that year. Her journey from the sun-drenched plains of northern Italy to the damp, cooling forests of the Ile-de-France was not merely a family visit, it was a calculated diplomatic invasion. She traveled with a massive retinue, her carriages heavily laden with gifts, correspondence, and an ironclad determination to extract concessions from her father's beleaguered government. She was no longer the homesick, tearful girl who had been shipped off to Spain 2 decades earlier. She was a seasoned political operator, hardened by the frustrations of a minor Italian court and fiercely ambitious for her own lineage. Her arrival at Versailles was treated with the pomp of a returning conqueror, yet the palace she re-entered was a master class in contradiction. From a distance, the Grand Chateau was the architectural embodiment of divine right, its golden gates gleaming, its hall of mirrors reflecting the wealth of a global superpower. But up close, the reality of 18th century royal living was an assault on the senses. The corridors, teeming with thousands of courtiers, servants, guards, and petitioners, were notoriously filthy. Behind the velvet drapes and beneath the grand staircases, people relieved themselves openly. The scent of crushed flowers, heavy musks, and burning incense fought a constant losing battle against the pervasive stench of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and human excrement. It was a gilded petri dish, an environment where supreme aesthetic beauty masked a terrifying lack of basic sanitation. Louise Élisabeth, swathed in layers of heavy silk and rare lace, moved through this environment with the grace of a woman who commanded it entirely, utterly oblivious to the microscopic predators that thrived in the stale, overcrowded air of the court. The emotional core of her visit was, as always, her father. King Louis XV was a man plagued by profound melancholy and acute boredom, carrying the weight of a failing war and the grief of past losses. The death of Louise Élisabeth's twin sister Henriette in 1752 from the very same disease, smallpox, had left a permanent scar on the monarch's psyche. When his eldest and most beloved daughter returned, it was as if a sudden burst of vital energy had been injected into his gloomy routine. She bypassed the rigid, suffocating etiquette that governed his interactions with everyone else, demanding his time, making him laugh, and pulling him out of his depressive stupors. But her affection was entirely intertwined with her political agenda. She spent her days locked in intense secretive meetings with Etienne François, the Duc de Choiseul, the king's chief minister, and the architect of French foreign policy. She was negotiating the Treaty of Versailles, desperately trying to secure territorial expansions for Parma at the expense of Austria, and meticulously arranging the dynastic marriages of her children. She was orchestrating the betrothal of her eldest daughter, Isabella, to the future Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, a move that would elevate her own bloodline to the highest pinnacle of European royalty. She was playing a magnificent game of chess, moving armies and fortunes across the continent with the stroke of a quill. Yet, while the Duchess of Parma was rearranging the map of Europe, an entirely different, invisible campaign was being waged within the corridors she walked. Variola major, the most lethal strain of the smallpox virus, was a constant, shadowy resident of 18th century Europe. It did not care for titles, treaties, or divine right. It was an opportunistic killer that survived in the microscopic droplets, expelled by a cough, clinging to the threads of borrowed garments, or resting on the surface of a hastily passed letter. Because the court of Versailles was a closed, densely packed ecosystem where physical proximity was mandated by protocol, it was the perfect hunting ground for contagion. It is impossible to know the exact moment the virus breached her defenses. It could have been inhaled during a crowded mass in the royal chapel, or transferred from the gloved hand of a visiting diplomat, or lingering in the stagnant air of a poorly ventilated antechamber. The terrifying genius of smallpox lies in its silent incubation. Once the virus entered her respiratory tract, it immediately hijacked the local macrophages, the very immune cells designed to protect her, and used them as transport vehicles to travel to her lymph nodes. For 12 to 14 days, Louise Élisabeth felt absolutely nothing. She continued to dominate the court, hosting lavish dinners, dancing in the dimly lit galleries, and exerting her iron will over Choiseul and her father. She felt vibrant, powerful, and entirely in control of her destiny. But beneath the surface of her skin, within the dark marrow of her bones, and the network of her spleen, the virus was replicating at a catastrophic rate. Millions of viral particles were being mass-produced, preparing to flood her bloodstream in a synchronized, devastating wave. She was making plans for decades into the future, entirely unaware that a biological clock was violently counting down her final days. The contrast between her supreme political agency and her absolute biological vulnerability is the defining tragedy of her existence. She had conquered the most complex diplomatic court in the world, but she could not govern the cells within her own blood. The invisible threshold between absolute power and total physical collapse was crossed in the first week of December 1759. One evening, Louise Élisabeth was the commanding Duchess of Parma, sitting at her ornate desk in her grand apartments at Versailles, drafting correspondence that would reshape the political landscape of the Italian peninsula. She was surrounded by the finest tapestries, the glow of beeswax candles, and the absolute certainty of her own supreme agency. The next morning, she was a prisoner within her own flesh. The onset of malignant smallpox does not offer the courtesy of a gradual, gentle decline. It is a biological ambush. The millions of viral particles that had been quietly replicating in her lymph nodes and spleen for nearly 2 weeks finally burst into her bloodstream in a massive synchronized wave. This event, known medically as secondary viremia, triggered an immune response so violent and overwhelming that it immediately incapacitated the most powerful woman in the French court. It began with a profound, terrifying chill. Despite the heavy velvet curtains drawn tightly against the winter draft and the roaring fires in her marble hearths, Louise Élisabeth began to violently shiver. Her attendants, accustomed to catering to her every whim, rushed to pile furs and thick woolen blankets upon her trembling frame. But the cold was not external. It was radiating from the core of her bones. Within hours, the severe chills gave way to a catastrophic fever. Her internal temperature spiked to levels that began to cook her own proteins, likely exceeding 42 degrees Celsius. The sudden heat was accompanied by an agonizing generalized pain that defied royal vocabulary. She clutched her head, screaming into her silk pillows that she felt as though a heavy iron nail was being driven relentlessly through her temples. But the most horrifying symptom of the prodromal phase of virulent smallpox was the backache. The pain in her lumbar region was so severe, so utterly debilitating, that she writhed blindly in her bed, crying out to her terrified ladies-in-waiting that her spine was snapping in half. She began to vomit a vile, acidic mixture of bile and blood, unable to keep down even the smallest sip of water. The crisis summoned the elite medical minds of the French Empire to her bedside. Dr. Lasson, the personal physician to the king, and a man steeped in the highest academic traditions of the 18th century, arrived to assess the moaning, fever-struck princess. The tragedy of what followed was rooted entirely in the blinding arrogance of 18th century medicine. Lasson and his colleagues did not see a microscopic invader multiplying within her cells. They operated under the ancient paradigm of humoral medicine, a system established by Galen and Hippocrates, which dictated that all human health relied on a delicate balance of four internal fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Sickness was perceived strictly as an internal failure, an excess or corruption of these humors, never an external attack. When Lasson looked down at the brilliant red, boiling flush of Louise Élisabeth's skin, felt her racing, hammering pulse, and observed her violent agitation, he made a fatal, systemic misdiagnosis. He concluded that her blood was literally overheating and boiling over, filled with corrupt, acrid humors caused by the stress of her travels and her intense political maneuverings. He diagnosed her with miliaria, a severe sweating sickness or heat rash. Because the diagnosis was rooted in humoral imbalance, the prescribed treatment was entirely focused on forcing the toxic excess out of her body. The physicians ordered the windows of her chamber to be sealed shut to prevent any fresh, cold air from shocking her system. They stoked the fires higher, turning her bedroom into a suffocating, oxygen-deprived oven. They piled more heavy blankets upon her thrashing body, determined to make her sweat out the corrupt humors. In doing so, they trapped her in a stifling microclimate that only accelerated the agonizing escalation of her fever. Louise Élisabeth, blinded by the pain in her head and severely dehydrated from the constant vomiting, lay trapped in this artificial inferno, completely surrendered to a medical doctrine that was inadvertently fueling her destruction. For 3 days, the fever raged unbroken, leaving her physically exhausted and frequently delirious. Then, around the 4th day, the fever seemed to break, dropping slightly and offering a cruel, fleeting illusion of recovery. But this temporary respite merely signaled the transition from the invisible viral phase to the catastrophic cutaneous phase. Small, flat red spots known as macules began to appear on her tongue and the roof of her mouth, making it agonizing to swallow or speak. Within 24 hours, these red marks spread rapidly across her face, traveling down her neck, over her pale, plump torso, and finally covering her arms and legs. To the uneducated eye, it might have looked like the severe heat rash the doctors had predicted, but these were not the innocent marks of miliaria. The macules quickly raised into firm, hard bumps called papules, feeling to the touch like small lead shot buried just beneath the surface of the skin. It was at this juncture that the true malignant nature of her infection revealed itself, sealing her fate in the most horrifying manner possible. Louise Élisabeth was not suffering from a standard discrete strain of smallpox, where the lesions remained separated by patches of healthy, unaffected skin. She was falling victim to the confluent variety, the most aggressive and destructive manifestation of the disease. Because her viral load was so astronomically high, the hard papules did not stop growing. They expanded rapidly, filling with a cloudy, opaque, foul-smelling fluid, transforming into massive pustules. But there was no healthy tissue left between them to halt their spread. As the physicians and attendants watched in paralyzed horror, the thousands of individual pustules across her face and body began to merge. They fused together, obliterating the boundaries of individual sores until they formed an unbroken solid sheet of thick white pus. The biological reality of this confluent state is almost impossible to comprehend without resorting to the language of horror. The variola virus does not merely sit upon the skin, it attacks the structural integrity of the epidermis, actively destroying the connective tissue that anchors the outer layers of skin to the dermis below. Because the pustules had merged into a singular massive sheet, the top layer of Louise Élisabeth's skin completely detached from her body. Her own fat layers, heavily targeted by the virus, began to undergo necrosis, liquefying beneath the ruined epidermis. The beautiful, commanding Duchess of Parma was literally shedding her skin in massive, sickening swathes. Every time she moved in her delirium, every time her chest expanded to draw a ragged, shallow breath, the friction tore the necrotic sheet of confluent pustules. The grand silent chamber of Versailles was filled with the distinct, wet, tearing sound of a human being's flesh ripping apart under its own corrupted weight. Her face, the famous Jai non Versailles that had charmed ambassadors and secured the borders of Parma, was the first casualty of this aggressive tissue destruction. The confluence of the pustules was always most severe on the face and extremities. Within a matter of days, her features were completely obliterated by massive weeping edema. The swelling was so severe that her eyes were pushed tightly shut, leaving only two dark weeping slits plunging her into a terrifying world of absolute darkness and unimaginable pain. She could no longer see the gilded ceilings of her royal cage or the terrified faces of her servants. Her lips, once painted and poised for political debate, cracked wide open, continuously leaking a thick, foul yellow serum. Her nose swelled grotesquely, the cartilage beginning to necrose from the inside. The inside of her mouth and throat were so heavily choked with expanding lesions that she could not close her jaw. She lay there, her mouth locked in a permanent silent scream, a continuous stream of saliva mixed with sour pus dripping uncontrollably down her ruined throat and onto the silk sheets. The psychological terror of this transformation was as profound as the physical agony. In her moments of lucid consciousness, dragging herself out of the fevered delirium, she could feel the total destruction of her physical form. For a woman whose entire existence, power, and influence in the 18th century world were intrinsically tied to her physical presence and courtly beauty, the realization that she was becoming a monster was a psychological torture of the highest order. She thrashed against the heavy linens, her hands sometimes blindly coming up to claw at her own ruined face in the darkness, tearing away strips of dead tissue in a desperate, primal panic. She screamed out for the king, begging for the father who had always protected her, crying out that she was being eaten alive, pleading for someone, anyone, to stop the tearing of her skin. But Louis XV could not save her. The monarch who commanded the largest armies in Western Europe was rendered utterly powerless by the microscopic violence unfolding in his daughter's bedroom. The king, notoriously terrified of sickness and death, had initially rushed to her apartments when the fever first struck. But as the confluent rash emerged and the horrifying reality of the smallpox became undeniable, the strict protocols of the court and the primal fear of contagion forced him away. He was barred from entering her chamber. He paced the long mirrored corridors of Versailles, weeping bitterly, a father separated from his favorite child by a wooden door and an invisible cloud of death. The air around her apartments grew heavy with the sickening metallic stench of gangrene and dying flesh, a smell so potent it began to seep under the doorways and out into the grand halls, sending courtiers fleeing in panic. Louise Élisabeth was entirely isolated, left in the hands of the physicians who were about to mistake her agonizing destruction for a medical puzzle that required brutal intervention. The absolute isolation of the Duchess of Parma was not merely physical, it was ideological. As Louise Élisabeth lay trapped in the blinding, suffocating agony of Confluent smallpox, the men tasked with saving her life were preparing to deliver the fatal blow. The tragedy of her final days is inextricably linked to the profound arrogance of 18th century medical science. Dr. Lasson and the elite royal physicians who surrounded her bed were not malicious men. They were highly educated, deeply respected academics who had spent their lives mastering a medical philosophy that was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. They viewed the human body not as a complex system of cells and immune responses fighting a microscopic invader, but as a hydraulic engine governed by 4 internal fluids. Disease in their minds was always an internal failure of volume and pressure. The terrifying sheet of white pus that had consumed the princess's flesh, the violent fever that was cooking her organs, and the delirium that racked her mind were all interpreted as the absolute proof of one thing: her body was overflowing with corrupt, boiling blood. To save her, the medical doctrine of the era demanded that this toxic excess be violently evacuated. They called it depletion therapy. As the viral destruction of her epidermis reached its absolute peak and her body entered a state of profound physiological crisis, the doctors convened and made the decision to intervene with steel. They determined that the venom had to be drawn away from her vital organs, specifically her heart and her brain, by opening a vein at the furthest possible extremity. They chose her foot. The physical reality of this procedure defies modern comprehension. The bedchamber was heavily darkened, stiflingly hot, and saturated with the thick, sweet, rotting stench of dying tissue. The attendants, trembling and terrified of breathing the contaminated air, were forced to approach the bed to physically restrain the writhing, delirious princess. They had to be exceptionally careful. Any pressure applied to her arms or torso caused the necrotic confluent sheet of pustules to tear away in massive weeping swathes, exposing the raw, hyper-inflamed musculature beneath. They reached for her feet, hoping to find a patch of skin stable enough to withstand the surgical blade, but the variola virus had spared nothing. The skin of her feet was heavily ulcerated, the dark, hard pustules having already merged and begun to weep. A royal surgeon stepped forward, holding a cold, unsterilized steel lancet. Without the benefit of anesthesia, while Louise Élisabeth moaned and thrashed in the darkness of her swollen, blinded eyes, the surgeon pressed the blade deeply into the raw, ulcerated flesh of her living foot. He made 3 to 4 deep, deliberate incisions, cutting through the tearing skin and searching for a vein. The physiological response was a grim testament to her failing system. In a healthy patient subjected to bloodletting, the blood would spray outward in a bright red, oxygen-rich arc. But Louise Élisabeth was already in the terminal stages of hypovolemic shock. Her body was desperately pulling blood away from her extremities to protect her failing internal organs. The fluid that emerged from the deep cuts in her foot did not spray. It oozed out weakly, a thick, dark, sluggish stream of deoxygenated blood mixed heavily with the foul, yellow pus from the surrounding ruptured lesions. The scent of the freshly spilled corrupted blood mixed with the gangrenous odor of the room, creating an atmosphere that turned the stomachs of the veteran physicians. Despite her weakened state, the agony of the deep lacerations pierced through her delirium. She shrieked, her jaw cracking open, pulling at the sores in her throat as she begged them to stop, crying out that they were killing her. But the physicians, anchored to their dogma, believed that the dark, sluggish nature of the blood was proof that it was profoundly corrupted and needed to be drained further. They continued the procedure, bleeding a woman whose cardiovascular system was already on the brink of total collapse. When the bleeding finally ceased, leaving her ghastly pale beneath the terrifying mask of pustules, the doctors initiated the second phase of their therapeutic torture. Believing that the corrupt humors needed continuous avenues of escape, they applied chemical vesicants to her ruined skin. These were highly caustic ointments, often derived from toxic beetles like the Spanish fly, designed to intentionally cause severe chemical burns and massive weeping blisters. They smeared these caustic agents over her already tattered, virus-ravaged flesh. The chemical burns layered over the viral necrosis created an unimaginable symphony of pain. Through these brutal interventions, the royal physicians inadvertently delivered the killing strike. The variola virus was systematically destroying her cells, but the deep incisions in her foot and the massive chemical burns provided something equally lethal: unrestricted entry points for bacteria. In the filthy, unsterilized environment of the 18th century palace, bacterial pathogens immediately flooded her open wounds. She developed overwhelming systemic sepsis. Her blood, already depleted of volume, became entirely toxic. Her immune system, already losing the war against the smallpox, was completely shattered by the bacterial invasion. Her heart began to beat with a frantic, chaotic rhythm, attempting to pump a diminishing volume of poisoned blood through a disintegrating vascular system. She was no longer just dying of confluent smallpox. She was being killed by an iatrogenic infection directly introduced by the men trying to save her. As her body spiraled into this final fatal sepsis, the rigid protocols of the French court demanded that the spiritual health of the royal family be attended to. If the king's favorite daughter was dying, she required the last rites. A royal priest, bearing the viaticum and the holy oils, was summoned to the grand apartments. The corridors outside her chamber were completely deserted, the courtiers having fled to the furthest wings of the palace to escape the terrifying reality of the contagion. The priest walked alone down the gilded hallway, clutching the heavy silver crucifix, murmuring prayers for the soul of the Madame Infante. He reached the heavy, ornate double doors of her bedchamber. 2 guards, their faces wrapped tightly in thick layers of linen, stood rigidly at attention, their eyes wide with poorly concealed panic. Slowly, the heavy wooden doors were pushed open. What met the priest was not a sight, but a physical blow. A solid wall of odor rolled out of the superheated chamber, a miasma so intensely concentrated, so profoundly sickening, that it struck the holy man like a fist. It was a dense metallic smell of advanced rot, heavily laced with the sharp acidic tang of sour pus, the heavy odor of raw, uncontrolled excrement, and the unmistakable, terrifying scent of gangrenous decay. This was the smell of a human body that had begun to decompose while the heart was still beating. It is a historical anecdote, widely circulated in the terrified whispers of the court, that the sheer density of the putrid air rushing out of the room instantly snuffed out the flame of the candle the priest was carrying. The priest, a man accustomed to the solemnity of royal deathbeds, was entirely broken by the biological horror before him. He did not step into the room. He did not approach the bed to anoint the dying woman. He collapsed to his knees on the polished parquet floor of the corridor, his stomach violently rejecting the odor. He vomited profusely right there at the threshold of the chamber, clutching his crucifix and screaming out to the empty hallway that the devil himself was lying in that bed. The absolute failure of the spiritual intervention in the face of raw, putrefying biological reality stands as one of the most stark, horrific moments in the history of Versailles. There was no grace, no divine comfort, no elegant farewell. There was only rot, panic, and the desperate, rattling breaths of a woman trapped in a melting shell. Louise Élisabeth's agony finally ended on the afternoon of December 6th, 1759. Her frantic, failing heart simply gave out. The blood pressure dropped to 0. The ragged, wet, tearing sounds of her breathing ceased, and the Duchess of Parma died. She was 32 years old. But the terrifying ordeal of the Madame Royale did not end with her final breath. In a standard royal death, the cessation of breathing marks the beginning of a highly choreographed, beautiful ritual. The body is washed, embalmed, dressed in magnificent state robes, and laid out for the court to pay their final reverent respects. The king would come to kiss the cold forehead of his beloved child. None of this was possible for Louise Élisabeth. Confluent smallpox, particularly the virulent strains that trigger severe sepsis and hemorrhaging, is notorious for destroying the cellular walls and connective tissues before death even occurs. When the heart stops, the body lacks any internal structure to hold itself together. Because Louise Élisabeth was a naturally plump, robust woman, the extreme fat necrosis that had been taking place under her ruined skin accelerated with terrifying speed the moment her blood stopped flowing. The enzymes in her body, unleashed by the cellular destruction, began to aggressively digest her remaining tissues. Within 2 short hours of her death, the heavy confluent sheet of necrotic pustules completely detached from the underlying muscle. The thick layer of adipose tissue beneath her skin entirely liquefied. By the 4th hour, the attendants who bravely peeked through the crack in the door witnessed a sight that shattered the very concept of human dignity. The body of the king's favorite daughter had lost all anatomical cohesion. She had literally melted. Her remains had collapsed into a long, dark, gelatinous puddle of biological matter, measuring roughly 1.6 meters, adhering tightly to the fine linen sheets of the royal bed. There was no recognizable face, no limbs, no human form, only a thick, sticky, foul-smelling residue of black fluids, yellow fats, and decaying tissue. The panic that gripped the royal household was absolute and feral. The strict ancient protocols of the French monarchy were instantly abandoned in the face of this liquefying contagion. The king was sequestered far away, paralyzed by grief and fear. The royal guards and undertakers knew they could not attempt to move her body with their hands. To touch the gelatinous mass was unthinkable. To breathe the air in the room was considered a death sentence. Acting with desperate, frantic haste, they brought in long wooden shovels, the kind used for mucking out stables. Wearing masks soaked in vinegar, they entered the stifling, horrific chamber. With brutal efficiency, they used the wooden shovels to scrape the sticky, liquefied remains of the princess, along with the heavily soiled bed sheets directly off the mattress, dumping the foul mass into a waiting coffin lined with heavy lead. There was no state funeral, no line in honor, no final kiss from a weeping father. There was only the urgent, desperate need to contain a biological hazard that threatened to wipe out the entire royal line. The immediate aftermath of Louise Élisabeth's death was governed not by the stately ancient rhythms of royal mourning, but by the frantic, primal imperative of biological containment. In the rigidly structured world of 18th century Versailles, the death of a daughter of France was meant to be a meticulously choreographed spectacle. The court was supposed to enter a period of deep formal mourning, draped in heavy black wool and violet silks. The body was meant to be washed with scented waters, embalmed by the royal apothecaries, and laid in state upon a magnificent catafalque, surrounded by thousands of burning beeswax candles, so that the nobility could file past and offer their final respects to the divine bloodline. For the Duchess of Parma, every single one of these traditions was instantaneously abandoned. The sheer terror generated by the rapid liquefaction of her remains and the overwhelming metallic stench of gangrene radiating from her bedchamber shattered the protocols of the absolute monarchy. The room had become a lethal hazard. The men tasked with sealing her away were not the delicate courtiers or the high-ranking prelates who usually attended the royal dead. They were laborers, guards, and tradesmen, driven by an intense fear for their own lives. Once the dark gelatinous mass of her dissolved remains and the ruined, soiled limbs had been hastily shoveled into the heavy oak coffin, the true measure of their panic was revealed in the method of sealing it. A simple wooden lid, nailed shut, was deemed entirely insufficient to contain the virulent miasma. The carpenters stepped back, and the plumbers of the royal household were brought forward. They carried heavy iron braziers filled with glowing coals and crucibles of raw lead. Right there, in the once magnificent royal bedchamber, they melted the lead until it glowed with a dull, silver-gray heat. A thick inner shell of lead had already been fitted inside the oak box. Now, the heavy lead lid was lowered into place. The workers, their faces tightly wrapped in vinegar-soaked rags to filter the suffocating odor of decay, poured the boiling molten lead directly along the seams of the metal casing. The heat of the molten metal, coming into contact with the cold edges of the coffin, and inevitably with the damp biological residue that had splashed against the inner walls, produced a violent, hissing steam. Eyewitnesses recorded the sickening detail that as the plumbers worked frantically to solder the seal, small amounts of the princess's liquefied remains seeped upward through the expanding joints, bubbling and sizzling as they mixed with the liquid lead. They were not merely closing a casket. They were welding shut a biological time bomb, creating a hermetically sealed vacuum to trap the corrupting virus and the rotting flesh within. While this grim industrial labor was being carried out in the dark, sweltering chamber, King Louis XV was fleeing. The absolute monarch, the man whose word was law across millions of subjects, could not bear to remain in the same palace as the decomposing remains of his favorite child. Paralyzed by his well-documented phobia of sickness and death, and broken by a grief so profound it bordered on madness, the king abandoned Versailles. He ordered his carriages prepared and fled into the freezing December night to the Château de Marly, seeking refuge in isolation. He left behind a court in absolute disarray, terrified of the contagion and horrified by the sheer indignity of the Madame Infant's demise. There were no public tears, no grand processions through the cobbled streets of Paris. Under the cover of darkness, stripped of all royal pageantry, the heavy, lead-welded box was loaded onto an unadorned carriage. It was driven quietly and swiftly away from the glittering gates of Versailles, heading north towards the ancient Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional necropolis of the French kings. The journey to Saint Denis was a silent, hurried affair. When the carriage arrived at the massive Gothic cathedral, the monks received the heavy burden with profound trepidation. They did not open the casket. They did not perform the elaborate days-long vigils that normally accompanied the arrival of a royal corpse. They simply carried the immense weight of the oak and lead down into the freezing, damp darkness of the Bourbon crypt. The coffin was hoisted onto rusted iron trestles, placed among the silent, velvet-draped tombs of her ancestors, and left to the absolute dark. For 34 years, the lead sarcophagus of Louise Élisabeth rested in the subterranean silence of Saint Denis. Above ground, the world she had fought so fiercely to dominate was entirely transformed. The intricate diplomatic treaties she had spent her final days negotiating slowly fell apart. The balance of European power shifted repeatedly. In 1774, her father, Louis XV, would meet his own agonizing end, ironically falling victim to the very same disease that had destroyed his daughter, dying of a severe case of smallpox that left his body so putrid that his courtiers also fled his deathbed in terror. He was brought down to the same dark crypt to lie near the daughter he had failed to save. The French throne passed to his grandson, Louis XVI, and his queen, Marie Antoinette. The immense financial debts accumulated during the wars, the rigid inequalities of the social order, and the shifting philosophies of the Enlightenment began to boil over. The magnificent, insulated world of Versailles, which Louise Élisabeth had believed to be eternal and mandated by God, was hurtling toward a violent, catastrophic collapse. Inside the sealed vacuum of the lead coffin, a different kind of slow, inevitable collapse was taking place. The Confluent smallpox had already completed its violent work, but the natural processes of the earth continued. Trapped within the airtight metal casing, without oxygen or the interference of the outside world, the last remaining tissues, the fragmented bones, and the heavy silks she had been scraped up with were subjected to a slow, dark alchemy. The gelatinous residue dried and broke down into a fine, toxic dust, leaving almost nothing behind but the horrific memory of her final days. The profound irony of her existence reached its ultimate crescendo in the autumn of 1793. The French Revolution had descended into the Reign of Terror. The monarchy had been abolished. Louis XVI had been decapitated by the guillotine, and Marie Antoinette was awaiting the same fate in a damp prison cell. But for the most radical revolutionaries, the execution of the living royals was not sufficient to cleanse the nation. They needed to eradicate the physical history of the divine right of kings. They needed to destroy the myth of royal supremacy at its very root. In August 1793, the National Convention issued a chilling decree. The tombs and mausoleums of the former kings erected in Saint Denis were to be systematically destroyed. It was an act of state-sponsored iconoclasm on an unprecedented scale. Mobs of citizens, accompanied by municipal commissioners and armed with heavy iron crowbars, pickaxes, and sledgehammers, descended upon the ancient basilica. They shattered the stained glass, dragged down the marble statues, and broke open the heavy stone floors to access the crypts below. Their motives were twofold: ideological destruction and the desperate need for raw materials. Yet their interventions were indistinguishable from torture. They met a biological crisis with blades and burning chemicals, transforming a devastating viral infection into a prolonged, agonizing execution. They operated in the dark, fighting ghosts while the real enemy multiplied in her blood. The tragedy of Louise Élisabeth is the tragedy of a brilliant, ambitious woman trapped by the limitations of her era. She possessed a mind capable of understanding the shifting complexities of European geopolitics, yet she lived in a world that did not understand the simple necessity of washing hands, or the concept of microscopic contagion. She built treaties meant to last for centuries, completely unaware that a microscopic organism could tear her own flesh apart in a matter of days. Her life was a testament to the staggering heights of human ambition and the seductive illusion of earthly power. Her death, however, stands as a brutal, necessary reminder of our fundamental biological frailty. The virus didn't care that she was the daughter of a king. The quicklime didn't respect her title as the Duchess of Parma. In the end, stripped of the vast machinery of the state, she was simply a human being, suffering in the dark, subject to the exact same physical laws of decay and dissolution as the lowest peasant in the fields of France. In the space between her absolute power and her total physical erasure, we find the humbling, fragile reality of what it means to be alive.